Known as the Global Compact for Migration, the UN Migration Pact aims to make mass migration safe, orderly, and regular. The agreement is expected to be ratified in a UN meeting in Morocco on December 18th. However, there has been much political fallout over the pact, with the United States, Italy, Slovakia, Austria, Australia, Israel, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland, among other nations, all refusing to sign the document. The reasons are simple. The pact essentially brings the steady, slow simmer of mass migration from the Third World to a boil. Make no mistake, this pact is designed to replace native populations of Western nations as quickly as possible so that any and all nationalist movements will be neutralized through changing demographics. The agreement conflates refugees and asylum seekers with economic migrants, making immigration to Western nations essentially a human right, which would in effect be enforced by the European Court of Human Rights. The ECHR is the same court that recently determined that defamation of the Prophet Muhammad is not speech that's covered under a person's free speech. Furthermore, the pact will also make criticism of mass immigration a form of hate speech.
With regard to this global compact on migration, and the participating countries are set to sign this agreement. And one basic element of this new agreement is the extension of the definition of hate speech. The agreement wants to criminalize migration speech. Criticism of migration will become a criminal offense. And media outlets, and that also concerns you, that give room to criticism of migration can be shut down. The Compact for Migration is legalization of mass migration. It's declaring migration as a human right. So in fact, it will become impossible to criticize Ms. Merkel's welcome migrants politics without being at risk to be jailed for hate speech. So this agreement, to our humble opinion, is a coup d'etat of pro-migrant liberal globalists. And it will greatly benefit multinationals. Because, you know, countries who import the third world will become the third world. And it's absolutely clear, and you all know that in third world countries, multinationals dictate the rules.
Yep, complete and total tyranny. It's becoming a bit of a pattern lately, isn't it? Brexit is sabotaged, migrant quotas are being forced upon EU nations, Articles 11 and 13 of the EU Copyright Directive look set to basically censor the internet in Europe, the European Union wants an army and to become an empire, and now the UN Migration Compact will accelerate the downfall of the Western world by several decades. And you're not allowed to publicly disagree with it. Free speech will be completely lost. If you don't have control of your borders, you don't have a nation. But that's the point. The point is to rob Westerners of their homelands. It goes without saying at this point, anyone who is against their nation being turned into a province of the third world will be smeared as racist, a Nazi, xenophobic, bigoted, etc. And I can't help but draw your attention to the fact that Ireland has up until this point dutifully complied with every migration demand made of us, with Leo Varadkar celebrating 3,000 more paper Irish being granted citizenship in Kerry recently. In several small towns throughout the country, direct provision centres are being set up to house migrants in former hotels. These are towns and villages that in some cases have populations of only a few hundred people at the most. The media is not covering the protests and unrest that these asylum centres are generating from the local community, who obviously had no say in any of this. But then again, since when are the anti-democratic globalists all that interested in the consent of the public, especially when they'll simply ask you to vote again on a referendum in order to give them the correct answer? Recently, Fine Gael's Simon Coveney has said the following.
I happen to be somebody who is quite liberal on migration. I believe that Ireland has been enhanced significantly by the fact that so many people who are not born in Ireland are now part of our society and economy. But of course, we need to also ensure that we can manage the numbers that are being welcomed and that they can integrate appropriately. We estimate, and I was saying it earlier, over the next 20 years that the population of Ireland will certainly grow by an extra million people. Linked to that estimate is that half of that number won't have been born in Ireland. I think that will be a really good thing for Irish society, but we do need to manage it carefully so that we don't allow the politics of migration to play a big part in Irish politics, because I think it pulls us down a dangerous direction. But the Global Compact on migration is controversial. It's difficult because migration is very controversial. But this is the UN trying to get this balance right between the obligations that countries have and also the entitlements that they have to protect their borders as well.
In the next 20 years, the population of Ireland will increase by an extra 1 million people, half of which will not have been born in Ireland. This is based on current immigration numbers. It's hard to say how much greater that number could be if Ireland adopts the UN Migration Pact. Ireland and the UK still haven't pulled out of the agreement, so it looks likely that both governments are in favour of the plan. After listening to what Simon Coveney has said here, which any sane person should find alarming and downright disgraceful, it's clear that he believes that countries like Ireland have an obligation to open their borders, and that there should be no further discussion on the matter. These people know that this forced mass immigration is wrong. He states it's controversial. He just won't get into the reasons why it's controversial. The reason it's controversial is because it will radically alter the homelands of the native people against their will, changing their communities and making their towns, cities and suburbs very different, and in some cases less safe, as we've seen in other EU countries that are further down the mass immigration road. As groups and different tribes of people congregate into their own respective communities, ghettoization is inevitable. They're essentially forming micronations within the nation. And before too long, representatives of those communities seek to enter politics to represent and advocate on behalf of their own in-group. This is why Belgium now has its very own Islamic political party.
A party whose aim is to create an Islamic state is hoping to win seats in Belgium's October municipal elections. The Islam Party got 2 members elected in 2012, including one here in the Molenbeek area of Brussels. This year it will stand in 28 municipalities in all. Among its policies, it wants to separate men and women on public transport. The Islam Party, which also wants to bring in Sharia law, is focusing its efforts on conservative Muslims, but it says it doesn't want to violate the Belgian constitution. Voters will ultimately decide on the fate of the Islam Party in Belgium, which is home to more than 780,000 Muslims.
In 2014, it was revealed that Ireland grants citizenship to more foreign nationals than all other EU nations bar one. That country was Luxembourg. The next country in line was, unsurprisingly, Sweden. It's important to say that demographically, the indigenous Gaelic Irish people, which is to say the people who Ireland is supposed to belong to, are expected to become a minority in the country by 2050. But that estimate was made back in 2005, 10 years before the migrant crisis began. I should also point out that it's only been in the last 2 decades that Ireland has gone from being ethnically homogenous to being multicultural and diverse, with the native Irish people now only representing 82% of the total population. According to figures released in August of this year, 2/3 of people coming into the state are foreign nationals. The Irish Times article goes on to state, the CSO's latest population statistics show that of the 90,300 people who immigrated here in the 12 months to April, 2/3, 61,900, were foreign nationals, while the remainder were Irish nationals returning to live in the Republic from abroad. 90,000, with over 60,000 being foreign nationals. Extrapolating based on the current rate of annual inward migration and allowing for the usually higher birth rates of immigrants, it's not hard to imagine the native Irish being a minority in Ireland by mid-century. It's important to say that though nationalist political parties are emerging in Ireland, and you should support them, they're still very small and very much in their infancy when compared to other nationalist movements throughout Europe. It doesn't help that the Irish populace at large are still very much enraptured by progressive politics and fairly unaware of what's happening in their country and why. We're constantly being told that mass migration is important, necessary and inevitable. Our overly taxed public services have led to a crisis in the healthcare sector, where 750,000 people are on healthcare waiting lists. Keep in mind, Ireland is a small country with a population of just 4.6 million people. Additionally, we have a housing crisis because we simply cannot house new arrivals fast enough. The supply cannot meet the demand, and the ESRI, the Economic Social Research Institute, believes that the solution is not to curb migration, but to bring in more migrants to help build more houses. despite the reason for our housing crisis being the unsustainable numbers of foreign nationals coming into our tiny country. Unsurprisingly, we also have a homeless crisis that is absolutely shocking for a Western country. Despite being told how we're a fast-moving, progressive, tech-savvy, rich and prosperous knowledge economy with multinationals attracted to our low corporation tax rate and skilled workers, but a casual stroll from one side of Dublin City to the other will reveal a jaw-dropping reality. This country has a population of 4.6 million. Almost 10,000 people are homeless. And yet we're just expected to fling open the doors even more and engage in the same pathological altruism as nations like Sweden. Nearly 10,000 people. Just take a moment to let that sink in. In Ireland, 10,000 people would represent a mid-sized town. Despite this, the taxpayer is being forced to fund direct provision centres for asylum seekers. Why are new arrivals being prioritised over homeless Irish people? Figures from January 2018 state that 5,096 men, women and children, including 801 families, are living in the 34 direct provision centres across 17 counties in Ireland by the end of December 2017. These include 31 accommodation centres, 2 self-catering centres. I should point out that since then, new direct provision centres have been built all over the country, including in Ruski Leitrim, Donegal and Wicklow Town, with many more being opened on a regular basis and little being publicised about the objections from local people. So the better part of 10,000 people are homeless in Ireland. But we're taking in more asylum seekers and housing them, distributing them in rural areas across the country. It goes without saying that if we redirected these same resources to our own homeless people, we could reduce that 10,000 figure substantially. But what am I thinking? That would assume that the Irish government and the NGOs who push for more mass immigration actually cared about the native Irish people, and I see no evidence of that. When the plan is to replace the native population of a country, why on earth would our elites lift a finger to help the most vulnerable and disadvantaged in our society? A generation of young people have been indoctrinated into an anti-Irish cultural Marxist agenda, and for many, the novelty and euphoria associated with being a virtue-signalling progressive lefty-lovey simply hasn't worn off, as the worst aspects of cultural enrichment and vibrant diversity haven't fully manifested here just yet. The honeymoon period is still ongoing.
The face of the Irish population is changing. It's becoming so much more diverse, and our decision makers and their faces are not reflecting that, and that's not good enough.
We can't have Ireland just for the Irish. It has to be and has always been a very globalised country.
We're also not aided by our left-wing mainstream media that licks the boots of the EU whenever possible and lays on the pro-immigration propaganda.
The Migrant Rights Centre has said between 3,000 and 5,000 children are living with the fear of deportation. There have been calls for the government to look again at the 27th Amendment, which removed the automatic right of all people born in Ireland to Irish citizenship.
A migrant rights group says between 3,000 and 5,000 children living here are undocumented.
We will be calling on Minister Charlie Flanagan to introduce legislation in this area so that no child and no young person lives in fear of deportation in this country and grows up undocumented here.
So, by undocumented, they mean illegal. The report, of course, began by Sharon Ní Bheoláin saying between 3,000 and 5,000 children are living with the fear of being deported. So they're using children as a means of pushing this agenda. The poor children run the risk of being deported. But later, in the same news package, it becomes clear that these are illegal migrant children, obviously brought into this country by illegal immigrant adults. Now, apparently, they want the law changed so that people breaking the law can remain in Ireland. If you don't have the correct paperwork, you don't have the right to simply walk into this country. The reason this is brought up is because of the 2004 referendum on the 27th Amendment. It abolished the constitutional right for birthright citizenship. 80% of Irish people voted to end the practice. These activist groups are now pushing for the state to grant legal status to illegal migrant children who were born in Ireland to illegal migrant parents. The state would be completely undermining the 2004 referendum result if it did that. But the question I would have is, who are the employers who are hiring illegal immigrant workers in the country? As I said recently in my interview with Justin Barrett, in 1916, the idea of Ireland being for the Irish is a sentiment that would see you branded as a hero. In 2018, the idea of Ireland being for the Irish will see you branded a fascist, right-wing, bigot, and a small-minded xenophobe. Even our own political class now tells us that sovereignty is a backwards idea.
Let there be no doubt about where Ireland stands. We want nothing to do with a backward-looking idea of sovereignty. We remain absolutely committed to the ideals of the European Union.
Sovereignty, basically meaning that the state has the right to govern itself. Sovereignty is the very idea of national freedom and independence. Something that young Irish people today seem to have forgotten was an ideal that many Irish men died fighting for. While the French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire believes that the EU is a sovereign continent, which is to say the sovereign powers of all EU member states are consolidated to Brussels, something I'm sure Guy Verhofstadt would approve of.
And that is the real problem, colleagues. Why there is such a problem in this crisis? Because member states are reluctant to transfer new sovereignty and powers to the European Union. And we all know that the only way out of this crisis is a new transfer of powers to the European Union and to the European institutions.
Now, I want to conclude by saying something I don't say often enough. It's easy to become despondent, to see darkness everywhere, and to be filled with an almost daily sense of existential dread and fear for the coming future. Things are always darkest before the dawn. Now, I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm just like you. I'm an average person, just reacting to and commenting on the madness of our world. I don't know the best way to combat all of the problems we are facing in our countries. There are times when one wonders if it's best to simply retreat and shrink from these challenges, to slip away quietly and hope for the best. Perhaps someone else will come along and make it all right. But the truth is, it's like that line from the film Logan. Someone has come along. It's you. There is no cavalry. There's just us, now, here, what we do today that matters. What we do every day. So please, get involved politically, start attending political meetings, join your local nationalist parties and speak out louder, especially when you're told you shouldn't. There is no future for Western people if the current course continues. Whatever future you're building towards and saving for right now, whatever your dreams and aspirations, none of it will matter and none of it will be possible if we don't work to save our nations now. And you'll be called all manner of horrible things along the way, mostly by people who don't even realise how indoctrinated they are. I pity them, to be honest. Many of them will eventually wake up and realise that they've been on the side of totalitarianism all along. Some of them won't. It's important to remind ourselves that one day we will die. But what will we have done with our lives? Will we have lived apathetic lives of silent surrender and compliance, gradually losing our freedom, culture and homelands because we were too paralysed by the fear of being inaccurately labelled a racist? Or do we live an authentic life of meaning, celebrating the heritage that our ancestors fought to give us, and preserving and maintaining our civilization no matter the cost to ourselves? People need to understand what's at stake. There is no future worth living in if it's not a free future, and every day our world slouches that little bit more towards degradation and tyranny. The signs are there for anyone with eyes to see. Doing nothing is not an option. Silence is consent. If there is to be a future for our children and grandchildren, it can only be the future we make for them. The problem with noble causes against seemingly impossible odds is that they often seem futile, but nothing worth doing is ever easy. It's like that line from Angel, if nothing we do matters, then all that matters is what we do. Happiness, freedom, love, these are not things we have a divine right to. We have to work for them. Love is sacrifice. Love is what we do for other people, for our nation and for our families. So become politically active if you love your nation. Network in the real world with like-minded people and help to amplify this message in any medium you can. Pádraig Pearse was an Irish nationalist and one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising. He was executed, along with the other rebel leaders, making them martyrs. The sacrifice of those men galvanised the Irish people around their cause for Irish independence. The following is a quote from Pearse. Irish nationality is an ancient spiritual tradition, and the Irish nation could not die as long as that tradition lived in the heart of one faithful man or woman. But had the last repositor of the Gaelic tradition, the last unconquered Gael, died, the Irish nation was no more. Any free state that might thereafter be erected in Ireland, whatever it might call itself, would certainly not be the historic Irish nation.